Hello there, little masters, and welcome once again to the Prancing Pony Podcast, where today we're welcoming a true lore master to the common room.
And we've got a great big stack of old dwarven maps for him to decipher for us. Just kidding, we've only got one. West Duhal, my friends. I'm Shawn Marchese, the real-life Lord of the Mark, and I'm here with the man of the West, the Aragorn to my Aemir, Alan Sisto.
Thank you, Shawn. Does that map have moon runes on it for him?
It does,
Good.
Absolutely.
Well, folks, today we are very excited. I mean, excited doesn't even really that's not a good enough word, is it? But we are thrilled to be welcoming Professor Corey Olsen, the Tolkien Professor himself, to our humble little podcast. Professor Olsen is the founder and president of Signum University and Mythgard Institute. And because that's not enough, he's also the author of Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, a most excellent and audacious book that we'll be discussing with him today. And he is, of course, the host of the Tolkien Professor podcast, still going strong on iTunes and wherever great podcasts are available.
Indeed, he's truly the Gil Estelle, the guiding star for all of us Tolkien podcasters, and we are so honored and happy to have him here tonight. So, Corey Olsen, let me be the first to say thank you for all you've done for Tolkien enthusiasts, and welcome to the Prancing Pony Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Wonderful. And I really appreciate that. You know, when I started my podcast, about 10 years ago now, it was, for me, just a kind of whimsical undertaking. You know, it was a way for me just to be like, hey, I'm a scholar. I'm doing work on Tolkien. Wouldn't it be fun, instead of just publishing it in a journal that nobody has access to? Why don't we, just like put it out there and actually talk to people over the internet? Which seemed kind of a crazy idea. And just to see, it's wonderful to hear, about that you guys feel that, what I did on my podcast has been an encouragement for you guys. It's so wonderful just to look around and see more, really good, quality conversation going on about Tolkien, because there is such a, it is such an important thing for people, not just that Tolkien and Tolkien's work is so important, for so many people in their lives, but the ability to talk about it and to listen to other people talking about it is such a great opportunity for people. That's the main thing that struck me so much when I started my podcast was the hunger, that people showed for the number of times that people would say things like, and it wasn't really about me. Clearly, it wasn't about it. It was just like, I've wanted something like this for my whole life, and I felt the same way. I would have said precisely the same thing, when I was, earlier in my life before I started being a scholar too. So great to see this kind of thing, spreading and continuing, and that's been really fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah, I'd have to say, I think it is the community that has been what's been so important to me, just seeing the community of people that's out there and how many people just are, as you said, hungry to just talk about this stuff and learn more about it and discuss it with other like-minded folks. But thank you for that. I really appreciate it. Well, we always like to start with a little getting to know you question. I think you actually answered this pretty well in the introduction to your book, but for the benefit of our listeners who haven't read it yet, and hopefully will after they listen to this,
that's right.
When and how did you first discover Tolkien's work, and when did you realize that this love of Tolkien had turned into, I think your own words were, a fascination with medieval literature that you wanted to turn into an academic career?
Well, let's see. So the answer to the first question is I was 8 years old, and my parents had introduced me a year before. So I was 7 when my parents introduced me to the Chronicles of Narnia. They knew C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia, so they read the Chronicles to me when I was 7. Well, they read them to both me and my sister, who was 8. She was less interested. I was completely enthralled, and began, I think read nothing but the Chronicles of Narnia again and again and again for about a year. And it was after that one of my cousins, when I was hanging out with him at some holiday or other, said, "Oh, well, if you like the Chronicles of Narnia, you'll like this too," and handed me a copy of The Hobbit. And I still have the edition of The Hobbit that he handed to me. It was, the old Ballantine paperback, the one with the purple emu on the front.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I love that. I mean, it's a classic edition.
It really is.
some people don't know the story about, like the illustrator for that actually sent an apology to Tolkien after she'd later read the books, because she was put on like one of those things where the publisher's like, hey, produce a cover for us in like a week, and she didn't have a chance to read the books, so she had no idea the content of the books. Anyway, so it's a fun thing. But I always remember, I still have my copy of The Hobbit.
That's awesome.
And so I read that, and then quickly found The Lord of the Rings after that, and it was the kind of impact that Tolkien has had on me has been, I don't know, it's been so profound. It's hard for me even to remember it, if that makes sense. That is, like, people will say, like, how many times did you read The Lord of the Rings when you were a kid? I literally don't remember. It's like I don't remember a time when I wasn't continually reading it.
Just had to keep going back in.
It's actually hard for me to recall. There are some particular scenes that I'll remember my first reaction, but in some ways I actually feel kind of a loss, because I don't remember most of my first experience of reading the book. Yeah, exactly. Because my first read of the book was followed so quickly by my second read of the book that, those impressions, I can barely remember a time when The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings were not just like an essential part of my outlook on life. And so therefore also, I think there are a lot of things that I have only sort of through contemplation afterwards have come to realize were, sort of opinions or proclivities or things that were informed by Tolkien. And the medieval studies things was definitely one of those. I think that my interest in medieval stuff, I was exposed to very, very little sort of authentically medieval stuff. I'm not from a very learned family, so it's not like if you read, for instance, C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, and listen to his stories of growing up in the house where there were like walls and walls and walls of books and always being surrounded by this stuff and walking. That was not you. Not my experience. There were not all that many books in my house. And so, there were a lot of things that I just didn't know about. Right. So, probably the first authentically medieval work I read was Sir Thomas Malory, Le Morte d'Arthur, in some kind of modern translation, I believe, when I was in, maybe 7th, 8th grade. I found this and, was really interested in, it was, I think the version I had was some kind of abridged version, I believe, I hunted down the unabridged one by the time I was in high school and came to really love that. But, again, when I look back and I think about what was it that I loved about that, why did I take to medieval literature so strongly? Because by the time I went to college, I was not only planning to be an English major, I was planning to I was hunting down the medieval literature classes as hard as I could, from the time I went to college. And I really think, although I didn't make the connection at the time, I am sure that was because of Tolkien. And it's funny because I'm not one of those people that was following directly in Tolkien's footsteps, like the kind of invitations that Tolkien implicitly puts in his work, like, hey, aren't you interested in studying Anglo-Saxon? Like, wouldn't you like to know more about the language of the Rohirrim? And all of these other little kind of teasers that he gives, which have led so many people, and certainly through my career as a podcaster and of course also in my time at Signum University, I've met dozens and hundreds of people who have gone on to become Anglo-Saxonists and stuff but no, I was like completely deaf to all that stuff. I didn't do anything that Tolkien would have wanted. I didn't start learning languages. I didn't do any of those things, but there was something that really resonated for me with medieval literature. There's just something that I loved about it. And I am sure it was because of the way that I grew up steeped in Tolkien.
That's great.
That I just connected to all this stuff. So, awesome. And then of course the really funny thing was, Tolkien was something I took for granted to such an extent that I went my entire graduate school career without once even, like, the thought never crossed my mind, hey, I could teach Tolkien someday. Like, I was like, I was a Chaucer guy. Like, it's what I did. Right. And I'm like, okay, like I do Chaucer, I do Middle English. And it was, I'll never forget the moment when it was after I was hired. So I was in a tenure track position and the position so I was hired as a medievalist and, my predecessor had only been like part-time medievalist. He was actually a Victorianist who was on the side covering the medieval lit classes, and he was the one who had retired. So they had nobody. So one of my jobs when I was hired was to expand the medieval lit offerings. So the department chair was like, so, give me a list of some new courses that you would like to develop. And it was then when I was sitting there being like, what courses could I offer that people would like? That for literally the first time in my adult life, the thought crossed my mind, wait a second, I can teach a class on Tolkien. But again, it's, to some extent, this is a story about how slow in the uptake I am, but in other ways, it's a story about, again, just like how in some ways, how deeply Tolkien was woven into the warp and woof of my life that I never even thought of as a scholar.
From such a young age. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's, so becoming an actual Tolkien scholar seemed like cheating, when I finally started to publish on Tolkien and do that. I loved Middle English, still love Middle English, still love Chaucer, Chaucer, my second favorite author, but that always felt like work.
Yes, it still does.
Yeah, exactly. I published the first article I ever published in a scholarly journal on Tolkien. My article on the Song of the Ent and the Entwife, which I published in Tolkien Studies. Actually, I published as a result of a dare. My wife and I were talking about publications. I've been working on this Chaucer article for a really long time, and I made a comment about like how, oh man, like doing something on Tolkien, like that would be so. I made a flippant offhand comment about how after working on this Chaucer article for like 6 months, I could probably write an article on Tolkien in 2 weeks. And she's like, "Do it! I dare you!"
There you go.
And I did. I wrote that article in 2 weeks.
And the lesson you learned from that was not just how that you could write an article on Tolkien in 2 weeks. It's that you learned not to make flippant comments to your wife.
Exactly right. Yeah, be a little more guarded in making those kinds of claims. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, the dares will come.
Yeah, but it's
awesome.
So it's been of course amazing fun, and ever since then, all the stuff, the direction, the sort of very unexpected directions that my career has taken, and my book and all the work that we've done at Signum and the courses I've taught there and the program that we've been developing, it's felt like cheating ever since, just like that.
Like this is work. I get paid for this.
Yeah,
how is this so fun? I'm sure. Yeah.
It really is. It really is a wonderful blessing to be able to, spend my career, immersed in this thing that I so joyfully immersed myself in, so thoroughly when I was 8, and have never emerged since then.
40 plus years later. That's awesome.
Exactly.
Well, I'm sure a lot of our listeners know you best, or at least got to know you first, as the host of the Tolkien Professor. We were talking about this. You kind of answered this question a little bit in terms of that transition from just teaching a class to making it a podcast. And it sounded, my question was going to be, what was your original inspiration? But it sounds like really the thought process was just, hey, why put this stuff in papers that very few people can read, this out on the internet? What did you expect would happen?
Well, see, that's really interesting, because I can tell you it wasn't what happened. No. I'm not sure I did know what to expect. But it really was, for me, I have never been, like scholarly credentials and publication lists and things like that. That's never been what's motivated me. I always loved connecting with people. Classroom teaching was always what I loved most. Right. And so the idea of, it was really a kind of an existential crisis I was having. I think a lot of faculty, a lot of professors have that at some point or other, where you sort of sit down and say like, well, yeah. And you're like, well, like, what's the point of me? Like, what good am I doing in the world? Like you can kind of tell yourself that like you're making an impact in the lives of students, and that's good. But all the sort of the work that you pour into scholarship, and scholarship is important and stuff. And I'm not trying to, but at the same time, for me, it wasn't the amount of time that I would spend in writing articles, which, I knew that so few people were reading. When I'm writing, I'm I'm always thinking about the audience. Like I'm talking to people, right? And the knowledge of like I am only talking to really a kind of a pretty small coterie of people who are going to be reading this. Mm-hmm. And that I had a really hard time being motivated by that.
Yeah.
So the idea of saying, no, okay, I'm going to do the same quality of work. You know, I want to do the same kind of thoughtful work on Tolkien that I would if I were continuing to go out and publish lots of articles and scholarly books and things. But instead, I want that audience to be people, you know, to actually reach people.
And not just a few dozen, fellow academics.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
And honestly, I hadn't the faintest idea of what was going to happen. I didn't really have a plan. It was just like, hey, let's put this out there, and won't it be fun to do my scholarship with an audience, you know, and to be interacting with that audience. And I had, I had a sort of a general idea, right? I was like, okay, you know, because come on, it's not like I'm trying to do research on quantum mechanics or something. Like, this is J.R.R. Tolkien. There are, and I'm saying to myself things like,
millions of people saw the movies. They got to be interested.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I'm like, so I'm sure there are hundreds of people out there who would be really interested in talking about this. Exactly. That's totally what I would have said, you know, in 2007 when I had this idea. And I'll never forget the morning. So I started I started the podcast, and, you know, I was getting, I was on iTunes. And of course, as you know, iTunes doesn't give you statistics of, you know, how many downloads you get. A lot of people don't realize that, but you don't. So basically, I was just looking at my bandwidth used, you know, how much total, how many total bytes were being downloaded from my server in order for me to kind of estimate how many downloads I'd gotten. In any given day. So that was the sort of back end mechanism I was using to just try to keep an eye on, you know, how many people were listening.
Right,
so for the first couple weeks, there were, you know, maybe 15, 20 people a day. That seemed like a lot. You know, I was like, wow, you know, I bet by this time dozens of people have listened to my lectures. And then this one day I came downstairs in the morning and just turned on my computer and looked at it. And normally, so I was like several, like tens of megabytes of downloads. And it, you know, maybe 20 or 30 megabytes a day was about what I was doing. And then I came down to breakfast that morning and found that I had done about 150 gigs already that day.
Oh my goodness.
Wow.
Huge.
Like, whoa.
In one fell swoop.
Yes. And what had happened was somebody at iTunes had put me on the recommended list of
that's all
podcasts.
it takes. New and noteworthy,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I was on the new and noteworthy that week.
Is it fair to say that Shawn and I have been trying to get on new and noteworthy for a year and a half now?
I don't know. I mean,
no longer new and
it was probably just a, you know, I mean, who knows how they picked those, and it was you know, sort of novel, I guess, at that point in 2008 or whenever that was. But anyway, so that was, you know, from then on, it was just the numbers were ridiculous, you know, and I found that of course I had been wrong. There were not hundreds of people. There were tens of thousands of people who wanted to talk about this. And
what was the number? I think I've seen in your first year. Was it something like 250,000 in your first year?
At least, yeah. And again, this was all kind of estimates that I was making based on back end estimates and stuff. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I mean, the total number of downloads was in the hundreds of thousands within the first year, and after a couple years, it was up in the several millions. So
wow,
it was very.
That's only mildly intimidating.
That's
we're going to be we'll be hitting 250,000 probably around our 18-month mark. But you know, it's a different world these days. There are you know, so many more listeners, and it's I feel like that's still relatively small potatoes. As an experienced podcaster, what advice would you give us, or maybe if the advice is really hard advice, some other hypothetical Tolkien podcast out there?
I mean, I think the main advice that I would give is just, you know, talk about what you are passionate about. You know, I think, you know, this, I don't know if this is good advice or not, but I certainly never did much strategizing, when it came to this. What has always worked for me and what people have always responded to, and what I can tell from, when I hear from people, what I hear people responding to is, when you're passionate about something, that's what gets people interested, So, for a Tolkien, if you, you guys are running a Tolkien podcast, other people who might want to do a podcast about Tolkien, talk about what you love, talk about what you want to talk about. Don't try to strategize and be like, well, this is what the average podcast listener wants in a podcast. Like, it doesn't matter, because I can tell you, nobody would have thought in advance, like, what people really want in a podcast is recorded academic lectures. That's what's going to sell like hotcakes. Get in front of a class, lecture for 75 minutes, record that puppy and slap it up there, and it'll just
gangbusters.
Absolutely. But that's what I did, and that's because that's what I love, that's what I do, and so do what you love, and that's what that kind of authenticity is what people are, I think, going to respond to.
That's the advice I'd give to others too. I mean, not that we're, not that we have a ton of experience to offer
nowhere
that
near
from,
that yet. But
I mean, I think we found that to be absolutely true, right, Shawn? I mean, it's for us, our
definitely.
success has been based on just two guys sitting around talking Tolkien, but
focusing on the topics that we're really passionate about.
Right, exactly. And, coming back to those themes and. And starting, of course, with the Silmarillion, that helped too. But it's kind of crazy. We look up to your show and to you, and we're not academics, we're not professors, certainly. So we know we can't put on airs and try to be who we're not. We're just a couple of guys. Is what
just a couple of guys.
Yeah. No, that's and I would say, especially in the Tolkien world, credentials. Credentials don't mean a whole lot in the Tolkien world, really. I mean, some of the greatest Tolkien scholars I know don't even have degrees. I mean, Doug Anderson, the editor of the annotated Hobbit, and one of the most learned individuals I've ever met in my life, and certainly one of the foremost Tolkien scholars in the history of Tolkien studies, doesn't have a PhD.
Yep.
I mean, he's not a professional lit person. And that's true of so many. I mean, whenever I go to Tolkien conference, scholarly conferences, and I'm listening to papers and just sort of being a part of that, there's always a very large contingent of people who are they're not professors, they don't have PhDs. And again, certainly in my experience, I mean, I have no, if ever I did, and this was never really my bag, but if ever I was tempted, to be like, well, I am the expert and let me lay some knowledge on everybody, that was beaten out of me pretty quickly because, I mean, I get called up on everyone. There's so many people that I rely on, people that I know the text even better than I do because, I interact with them, and their recall of certain things, like I'll screw up things that they remember, and so it's funny, sometimes I'll call them out during a show, because I'll see they're attending live, when I'm doing a live show, and I'll be like, hey, Robert, do you remember what happened? Because I forgot about that.
Oh, that's
do you remember
awesome.
This because he'll know. I know he knows, and he's there, so, but that is to say, the Tolkien community is because it's been, from an academic standpoint, it's been kind of underground for so long,
right.
That its home is not and never has been, within academia. In fact, those of us who are in academia are kind of like the sort of weird countercultural in some ways.
Yeah.
So
a little bit. You're the fringe.
So don't, both for you guys and for others, who are, don't feel like the credential matters, because it really doesn't. It's funny when I call myself the Tolkien Professor at first. So first of all, I never actually called myself the Tolkien Professor. That wasn't the goal. It was my URL.
Really?
I wanted a web page, right?
Yeah,
I was designing a web page. And so I was trying to think I need a URL which is going to be memorable, and which will be transparent in describing who I am and what I'm doing. And so I came up with TolkienProfessor.com because I was like, okay, I want Tolkien to be in it because I want people to know that I'm talking about Tolkien. And and I'm a professor. I want to indicate that this is like a scholarly thing, so this is not, so because especially since at the beginning in particular, I was still an untenured faculty member. So I did have some sort of dreams of fighting the fight about what would count towards my tenure clock and alternative publication modes and that kind of thing. So I wanted it to be sort of overtly academic and just on a sort of a truth in advertising thing. And fairly quickly after that, people began to call me the Tolkien Professor, like I was like that was my title. And I was, and I tried to fight it for a while, but then I was like, no, I can't.
Not too hard. Can't fight that too hard.
Yeah.
But it's hard because I still get teased about this all the time by other Tolkien scholars, right? Who are like, oh, it's the Tolkien.
You're the Tolkien professor.
Yeah,
exactly. The one and only Tolkien Professor.
Yeah. No, Mike Drought was just giving me a hard time about that in a panel discussion we were doing at Mythmood. And he's like, I am so honored to be sitting next to definite article, the Tolkien Professor. Ribbing me about that.
If there's anybody who's well equipped to give you a hard time, it's Drought.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, no kidding.
He's very sharp. He's got quite a wit on him.
He sure does.
I'd be actually afraid to interview him. As nervous as I was to have you on the show, I'd just be terrified if it was.
Oh, he's great. He's so funny and so
he is hilarious.
That's great. Well, on the topic of academia, since we're talking about that a little bit, I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about one of your other projects, or maybe two of your other projects. In 2011, I think it was, you established the Mythgard Institute at Signum University. And your goal with those is basically to facilitate lectures and research and even offer graduate level academic courses online in things like Tolkien studies, fantasy, science fiction, medieval studies, language, so much more. Can you tell us a little bit about how you came up with this idea? Because it seems rather revolutionary to me.
It does.
Absolutely. Well, it grew totally organically out of my podcast, basically. I mean, one of the things that I found, and so, remember when this was, right? This was so really the kind of the hotbed of this was 2009 to 2010.
Right.
So, right about then, interactive online technology was increasing, like right around that same was like when the iPad first came out, so a bunch of ways of sort of thinking about interacting with things differently electronically and stuff. So that was sort of what was happening. So one of the things that I found throughout the early years of my podcast was people kept wanting more and more interaction. And I kept kind of being creative about new ways to do live sessions and stuff. So the sort of culmination of that was the Silmarillion seminar.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, I remember I got through a few of those episodes. Those were amazing.
It was incredible. Now that was a whim on my part. It was me saying, so I had never even really heard of webinar software. I mean, that was brand new to me at that point.
Yeah, it was.
So I had just gotten access to it through my school, through a webinar license. And I was like, okay, so let's try this out. So, it was an experiment. And again, this was just me experimenting with something to see if maybe this was another way I could do another interactive thing through my podcast. And I'd always wanted to do, a careful read through of the Silmarillion, like a discussion through the Silmarillion in detail anyway. So I was like, okay, two birds with one stone. Let's start up a Silmarillion thing and let's let's do it in this format in a webinar, using this interaction so that I can have live discussion with a group of people. The signups for it were, I just posted on Facebook one day, and it was actually the day before Thanksgiving. So it was it was during the Thanksgiving holiday of 2009, I think, that I started that. It was 2009. And so And I just took the first 20 people who responded to my post and invited them to the webinar. That was my scientific process of setting that up. And I went into it with really low expectations because I was thinking okay, I'm already convinced, obviously, as a podcaster, that the internet is a good way to distribute content.
Sure. Right.
And so let's try this interactivity thing. I was expecting that discussion would be able to happen. We'd be able to go back and forth and that it would work fine. But I was thinking the last thing on my mind was, oh, this is going to be just as good as like one of my regular classes. I mean, I've been a classroom teacher for a while at that point. And I was like, okay, obviously, this sitting around by our computers and talking, and so that we can just hear each other's audio is not going to be like a real class, but anyway, it'd be fun. And I was completely blown away by the experience. I mean, the Silmarillion seminar, not only did it really work as a discussion, but the way that chemistry developed among the students, I would never have guessed. I mean, the people from this, we still have like reunions with the people who did that. Man, I mean, I'm still in touch with a bunch of people from the Silmarillion seminar. And it's so, I mean, it's just, that was for me the eye-opening experience and really a life-changing experience because, I got really excited about it. And I was, as a teacher, I was like, this is incredible. Like you can really do, because here I was running these sessions for people who were all over, doing this from all over the world.
Right.
So you have people in different time zones and people in different countries. One of the people who was participating was blind, right? So I mean, all different like geographical locations, accessibility issues, whatever. But we could all get together and participate in this really dynamic, fun, awesome classroom experience. So I got really excited about it as a teacher and was saying this is a thing that needs to happen, and at the same time it is the future. Exactly. And I'm looking around and of course, again, so 2010, going into 2011 now at this point. And so online education was, I mean, of course it had been, people had been doing versions of online education for many years already, but it was beginning to creep into the mainstream, mostly through the University of Phoenix, which means it was still largely distrusted by
the for-profit institutes. Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Most people equated online education with diploma mill at that point.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So the first couple of years of my online education experience was mostly, starting off every conversation with, but no, really, we're a serious
we're not
that. We're for real. And it's nice not to have to start every conversation that way anymore. But
True.
Anyway, so that was, and so I was looking around at online education and what people were doing, and I was shocked to find that nobody was doing this kind of thing. Nobody was just saying like, let's like have a session. The technology is here. Let's have a session, open the mics, and have a classroom discussion. Instead, what everybody was doing in online education was essentially like the 19th century correspondence course,
right?
That you would take from the frontier.
You could download the curriculum and fill it out and send it in.
Right.
Yeah.
Except made more efficient through the internet, which is cool. I mean, again, like correspondence courses are great, and being able to do that efficiently there's like totally a place for that, and especially for independent learners who want maximum flexibility, that's excellent. But that's not everybody, and this is
really, you miss that community aspect.
Yeah, the classroom experience is part of it. It has to be.
Exactly. And it's what still to this day, I find when I talk to people, and I tell them I do online classes, one of the things that I often hear from people is, oh yeah, I tried that. It didn't work for me, which is an interesting comment if you think about it, right? Yeah. Nobody says that about brick and mortar schools. Nobody says like, oh yeah, like I went to school, but it didn't work for me, right? Like that you might make criticisms, but you're not going to say that.
No.
So, and I think when people say that, what they're mostly saying, and the experience that most of them have had is with that kind of sort of relatively static, totally asynchronous experience where it's all on you. You really have to be an independent learner to push yourself through it. And I can see why that doesn't work for a lot of people.
If you're not highly motivated, you're not going to move forward at all.
Right. Exactly. So, so basically, it was a combination of several things at once now. I was already fully engaged in the Tolkien podcasting and looking for ways to engage with all of these people following my podcast who are clamoring for more interaction and who were specifically saying we would really love to take a course. Could we do a course of some kind? Wow. Like a real Tolkien course. I'm like, well, okay. All right. I don't know how we can do that, but okay. So on the one hand, that was going on. On the other hand, I just, as an educator, I was getting really excited about the potential for this.
All the new tools, the new software, it's like a whole new paradigm. And I hate using that word. It's a cliched word, but it really was. It was a total shift.
Yeah. And so being excited about that, seeing the potential for that. And also, I mean, the other thing is I was a guy teaching, I was tenured by that point at the school that I was, but I was tenured at a small private institution, a small private liberal arts school with a pretty high tuition tag.
Yeah.
But I myself am from, a low middle class background, and I went to school on heavy financial aid,
right.
And so really, I'm very sympathetic, to the people who really struggle to make ends meet and to pay college tuition, and the whole student debt crisis is something that was really hard for me, especially as a professor. Every year I'm sitting there with my English majors, who are, and watching them graduate with $60,000, $80,000, $100,000 worth of debt, and it's just heartbreaking. It was, with my background, looking at that and knowing, these are not kids. Some of them, some of the kids, of course, at the school that I was at were like trust fund babies, and that's, whatever, that's fine for them. But again, I was really sympathetic to the, so I hated to see that, and it was hard kind of to be a part of that system. So with that, on the one hand, my positive excitement as an educator to say, hey, look, this is really great, a really great educational experience. And, my audience clamoring for stuff. This is what brought about the formation of the institution at the beginning, to say, okay, you know what? I'm just going to do this. This should happen. Nobody's doing it. I'm just going to do it, and we'll see what happens. And I started kind of, sort of a little bit informally, but pretty, the response was really strong, and the experience was really good. And I was like, no, this really should be a thing. So we quickly, set out to, establish a real graduate program. We did a graduate program because, that was where my podcast people were. And also it's much simpler when you're forming a school entirely from scratch with no funding, which is kind of interesting as an undertaking. And I could tell lots of stories about that are probably inappropriate. But the point, what would,
we'll have those. We'll have you tell those off air.
Exactly. But doing a master's degree program, I could just be focused and do what I want. I didn't have to be like a broad Bachelor of Arts.
Right. Sure.
Try to do all the departments and everything. I was like, no, let's just do literature focused on Tolkien studies and fantasy literature, and then we sort of we've expanded over time. Right now we have 4 concentrations. You can concentrate in Tolkien studies. You can concentrate in imaginative literature, which is sort of broader, that includes science fiction, non-Tolkien fantasy, and that kind of thing. We have Germanic philology because, of course, it's Tolkien people, right? So many people read Tolkien the right way, unlike how I did, and get bit by like the Germanic philology bug, which is awesome. So we have, it was really funny. I had a really funny experience with that this past year. I gave a talk at the annual convention of the United States Distance Learning Association. This big professional organization for online education, and I was just presenting on Signum and what we're doing. Is the first time I've really presented on what we're doing in that kind of environment, and so they're asking me like, so what are some of the the most popular courses that you're offering? I'm like, well, okay, this semester we are launching a new program which people have been clamoring for years, and we're finally offering it. We are offering an introduction to Old Norse, and everyone stares at me.
You just hear a pin drop.
Seconds, and then bursts out laughing.
Oh my goodness!
I thought that was hilarious.
That's awesome.
I'm like, we have a language program, and we offer Latin, Anglo-Saxon, and Old Norse. That's what we do. And,
that's awesome.
If the language can be spoken today, we don't teach it.
Exactly right. Only what's useful on the streets. That's what we teach.
There you go.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Man, that's awesome. Just a perfect story.
And of course, we're hearing that, and we're thinking, well, yeah, that's exactly what I want to learn.
Of course,
Old Norse, of course.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So being able to read the
Edda in the original.
Edda in the original.
Yeah, for sure.
Read Beowulf in the original. That's
man.
What. We're just we're expanding this year. We're having a 2-semester basic sort of overview of Germanic philology. So sort of to learn the sort of the core principles of studying philology, and to go back and look at the the progression from the old Germanic languages and Gothic and the relationships of all these different things. It's a fascinating study, but it's so we've settled in as this sort of niche program. And again, one of the beauties of online education, Germanic philology is dying almost everywhere in the world. There are schools everywhere are shutting down. There are very few places where you can go to study Germanic philology anymore, because most schools are closing down those kinds of historical linguistics programs. Because they don't have the local population to support it. But, if you collect from around the world, everybody who's interested in learning introduction, it's quite a large population.
So I bet it is.
It's another real advantage to what we do, and it's just a fantastic group of people.
That's a good point. Being able to apply scale, to be able to take, like you said, taking worldwide
across the world.
You could not do that at a single individual brick and mortar school. There's just not enough interest to justify the expense. But when you lower the expenses by doing it online and you increase the student base, you can do it, and for cheaper. Amazing.
Right. And a gift for future generations of wannabe philologists, Tolkien fans.
That's just it.
That's amazing.
At Mythmoot this year. So we do an annual conference called Mythmoot. And at our Mythmoot conference just a couple months ago, Mike Drought gave one of the keynote talks, and his talk was a wonderful talk, which we actually have embedded on our Germanic philology page now on Signum, because it was basically sort of, he gave a talk about the history of Germanic philology and sort of its decline and fall over the course of the 20th century and the reasons for that, and but like the benefits of Germanic philology and really sort of like why it's really important that we not lose philology and that we continue, and that why philology should be sort of remarried to the study of literature from which it was divorced, a couple of generations back. And it was really great hearing his talk, because that's really sort of like the charge of what we're trying to do, to really create an environment. It's because, again, it's one of the only places where this study is growing, and that's been really exciting. And so, it's one of the few places where you can go to say, I want to study Tolkien. I want to get a master's degree in literature with a concentration in Tolkien studies, where I'm just going to be focused on studying Tolkien and studying the languages that he studied. And there's so many different angles that people take at it, and so many different ways that you can get at it. But we're really the only program in the world where this is what we do. This is who we are, and that's been great. And still, being able to sort of keep applying, to continue forward with those other convictions that really launched it, to have all of our courses are synchronous and interactive. Every single one of our courses contains a central synchronous interactive component, so that, you're never left off on your own. You're always included in the classroom discussion. You're always interacting and getting to know your professor, and part of that relationship with your professor and with your classmates. And also our tuition is really low. Again, that was one of the other things, because it's hard. How can you? Many people look at the college debt situation, the student debt situation, and say like, oh man, these colleges are charging so much for tuition. They shouldn't charge that much for tuition. I can tell you from having, worked, having been tenured faculty at a college, and having, studied the budget and, talked over the budget at length in many, many meetings, I can tell you there's not that much they can't just reduce tuition. They can't. They're barely making ends. It may seem hard to believe that their tuition is so high and they're barely making ends meet, but trust me, they are barely making ends meet. But so how can you change the paradigm? How can you create, an alternative? And, my answer to that was ditch the campus.
New tech.
If you ditch the campus and invest yourself entirely in people instead. And that's what we do. So,
that's awesome.
So, our tuition is really low.
Awesome.
And and going to stay low, and so it's been a really fun adventure from like an entrepreneurial standpoint, from an from an educator standpoint, from a Tolkien studies standpoint. There's been a lot of
for sure
what we've been doing, and Signum has been a really, really fun adventure. But we're branching out into other ways too. We have we just did our first kids program, which was really fun. We did a Hobbit camp for middle schoolers over the summer.
Oh wow, that's cool.
which was really fun. We did that in partnership with local public libraries. So what we did was we had local public libraries from all over the country signed up with us. We ran daily live online sessions so that we could be interacting with kids and sometimes with groups of kids at once, sometimes individual kids. So we had essentially the sort of lecture discussion component at the center. Awesome. But then the kids locally would get together at their local public libraries and they'd do crafts and projects and stuff like that together.
Yeah, I knew about it. One of our listeners, Shawn, I can't remember who it was, messaged us and talked about how she was involved. She was was involved at a local library doing this exact thing.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
I can't remember who it was.
I'll have to. I don't remember.
But yeah, no,
cool. What a neat program.
That's been awesome. We had like 65 libraries signed up across the country. It was really neat to kind of hear some of the stories and get to connect with folks. Like we had this one library in Mississippi that was in this really remote place in Mississippi, and the library was so small. They contacted us and were like, we're really excited. We really want to participate in this, but we don't own a copy of The Hobbit. I was like, oh man. So I'm like, hang on.
Yeah, that's easy. Let's solve that problem.
Yeah. Exactly. So we immediately donated several copies of The Hobbit.
Here's a dozen. That's
great.
Yeah, and this is one of those things like, I was ordering them on Amazon and sending them to them.
Yeah.
And I put in their address, and Amazon was like, recalculating your delivery date.
Oh my goodness. That's a problem when it says that.
It took Amazon Prime a week and a half to deliver.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, wow.
Boy, that's a new definition of rural, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
They have to send them in by pack train, but
well, we were getting the mule together, and the mule wasn't back yet, so we had
on a pony.
Well, before we completely run out of time, I want to move on to our next question because I'm like looking at our list going, no, either Corey's going to have to stay longer than he's allowed us to ask, or we're going to have to cut everything super short. Real quick question. This is a short one.
First of all, I could say we can do a little extra time because,
we're also
all right.
Anyone who is familiar to my podcast knows I almost never start on time and I almost never end on time.
Well, our listeners know the same thing. I think when we started, we told our listeners we would never exceed an hour and a half, and I think our third Turin episode ended up being just a minute shy of 3 hours.
3 hours, yeah.
3 hours.
We won't do that again, but we have broken two.
That was our third of 3 Turin
we had
episodes.
a Turin trilogy. So
excellent.
Anyway, quick question, and you kind of touched on it a little bit. We want to find out a little bit more, but I think you already answered the question to some extent. We were privileged to be able to offer some time on the show to promote Mythmoot 4 back in June.
Yes.
And we hope to be a part of promoting that next year. And you mentioned that it's going to be next year because it used to be biannual. Is there going to be one next year?
There is. Yes, there is.
All right.
Well, tell our listeners a little about it. I mean, we told them, but you tell them because it was your project. So.
Oh man, Mythmoot is so much fun. It's the goal of Mythmoot is to be a combination, not like both of these things happening kind of awkwardly at the same place and the same time, but a real combination of a scholarly conference and a fan convention, like a place where people can get together.
Man.
Have fun, geek out,
that sounds
dress
like our
up,
kind of thing, Shawn.
talk about
that sounds
stuff,
like heaven. Yeah,
while
really
at the same time listening to top scholars give awesome lectures and being a part of
Presenting
panel
papers
discussions and paper presentations and all kinds of other sort of extra activities and stuff. So that kind of union of the fun and the scholarly has been kind of at the core of what we've been doing at Mythgard and Signum from the beginning. So Mythmoot is kind of the live in-person, annual event that tries to embody that. And this year was just magical. It was so good, Mythmoot this year.
And we heard
a lot of
we
that.
were seriously trying to figure out how to make it happen. And our schedule, it was just by the time we found out about it and found out the dates, it was just a little too late for us to try to plan the trip. But
we should be. We're not quite ready to announce dates yet for next year, but we're looking at around the same time. It'll probably be June-ish, June next year. It will be in the same location in Leesburg, Virginia.
Okay.
We did.
Well, one of our. I don't expect you to know this. When I say I'm speaking hypothetically to the general person. Our listeners know that our Patreon goals, our third one, if our patrons can get us to that level, one of them is that we promise to attend a conference and record a live episode from that conference. So we are hoping to be able to attend Myth Moot next year.
Oh, that would be awesome.
If our listeners can get us there. So we're looking forward to it.
Yep. Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah. We should do a session there next year. Yeah,
that would be awesome. Yeah,
that would be fantastic.
Podcasting and so that'd be great.
Oh, that would be awesome. We would love to have you back on. Yeah. That would be so much fun. And we're going to keep on flying because I'm looking at our list going, oh man, we haven't got to the book yet.
Yeah.
But that's okay. One of the more intriguing projects, at least for me, that you've been doing recently is Exploring the Lord of the Rings. These sessions are, the sessions are really informative and awesome. But setting those classes within the Middle-earth game world of the Lord of the Rings Online was an absolutely brilliant idea, and I wish I could steal it and still be original. I can't, so it's never going to be happening. But what was the impetus for taking what would have been really an otherwise good but ordinary seminar series and turning that into something totally unheard of, a video game-based experience? What made you go there?
The idea for that just came from the fact, so first of all, we've been sort of interacting with the Lotro community for several years now.
You've been playing, you've got a burglar, if I remember correctly, right?
I do. I've been streaming my burglar from his creation up through now. It's been 2 years now, I think. I've been streaming the adventures of Grifflet going through the epic quest lines in Lord of the Rings Online.
That's awesome.
I started playing myself maybe a year before that. So I'm not, one of the old timers in Lotro by any means. I resisted it. They tried to bring me in. They
bring you in early.
The old timers, like the players, from the
I'm an old timer,
beginning.
but I haven't played in like 4 years. I mean, that's the weird thing.
I've never played, Alan. You know that.
I do. Yeah, my a couple of my characters are leveled at 65 because that was what the cap was back then.
That was the cap at that point, right? Exactly.
I mean, I think I was there shortly after Mirkwood was released, and then we had kids. So
exactly. No, that happens. I was going to say
that's the reason I haven't gone in there.
Yeah, it's the kids.
Exactly. Well, that was the same thing with me too. When I was just starting my podcast, and then when I was still untenured, and when I was when my kids were young.
Sure,
I was
no chance.
I was resistant. What did me in, though, was attending a conference where one of the developers was speaking and showing stuff about the game and kind of talking through their own adaptation process. And I was just like, I can't fight this anymore.
Yeah, the atmosphere is just too cool.
This is now an academic imperative that I have to check this out. And I have, so exactly. So this is me, down in my basement being like, honey, sorry, research going on down here.
That's how
awesome.
I sell it.
Exactly.
There you go.
It's research. Absolutely.
It's research for the podcast. That's what you can tell your wife. Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
That's great.
But no, it's been awesome. So of course, another, there were several reasons, why I was really excited to dig in once I put my foot in it, like Bilbo going back into his parlor.
Yep.
And one, of course, is just simply my fascination in what they have done. I mean, it's so deep and so well done. It is. I have never seen an adaptation which is so intricately tied to the books, which has thought about them, reads the books so carefully and with such detail, and thinks about them really well. I mean, those are not the same thing. You can be meticulous in trying to include details, but the kind of thought that they've put into their storylines and the way that their storylines connect with book storylines is fascinating and really, really interesting. We have one of our master's degree students who's writing her thesis on Lotro and their adaptation and their storylines, actually.
Oh, wow. That would be a fascinating thesis to read.
Yeah, looking at them as an adaptation. So it's really interesting. But then at the same time, of course, people who play Lord of the Rings Online, like, these are our people, we knew that these were people. So, in wanting to, we really wanted, for Signum and Mythgard to be, kind of embracing that community and to kind of reach out to that community, because there were obviously people there who didn't know us and what we did, that we really wanted to connect with. And, we thought that was just a sort of an obvious crossover. So I'd been doing stuff with them all along, for the last few years. Yeah. And so the germ of the idea actually, the idea for Exploring the Lord of the Rings Online didn't come about as like, hey, I should do a detailed study of the Lord of the Rings. How can I do that? Maybe I'll do it in the game. It came the other way around. It was like, okay, I want to do a new thing engaging with the Lotro community. What should we do? And I was like, well, what we should do is let's do an actual, lore thing. Let's actually do a reading of the books. And let's do it in game, and then to do it in game and to connect it to the exploration of the world itself.
Right, the in-game locations,
Right.
Yeah, sort of paralleling, first looking at Tolkien's book and then thinking about their adaptation, because there's so much there and it's so interesting to do. So
so you can actually be in the place where, be on Weathertop or something like that.
Oh, absolutely.
So the way that I do it, I don't, that was my first thought too. It's like, hey, so like when we do the Weathertop class, let's go to Weathertop and do class from Weathertop. Right. The problem is it's really distracting, because when you're there, so
people are fighting, right?
There's exactly right. Yeah. Like the crows would keep respawning, and you'd killing them all the time.
Man, more mobs showing up. Yep.
Exactly. Right. That's distracting. So what
you need some tanks to draw aggro around the party.
Exactly.
Then you have to make sure that the seminar attendees are a well-balanced party and everything.
Yes.
Do we have any healers here?
Yeah. Right. Exactly. So the Lotro developers actually made me a lecture hall in game. So the place where I host the class from, they created so that I could teach class from there. So we have we sort of joke, this is Signum University's only campus. The Lord of the Rings Online.
And it's in Middle Earth.
Scholars Hall.
Is brilliant.
That's it. That's the campus. So they created that for us, and then from there we go out and do field trips, to visit the locations and look at how they're handling the stuff that we were looking at that night or
like
or
Bilbo's Trolls or Weathertop.
Exactly. Bilbo's Trolls and
Rivendell itself.
We just were looking at the Old Forest, and we haven't got Old Man Willow yet, but our next text-based field trip will be to Old Man Willow and Tom Bombadil's house.
That's awesome. I remember getting there the very first time with my very first character, probably in year one of the game.
Right.
Because I signed up when it was probably 6 months, maybe 8 months in, and I went ahead and I signed up for the lifetime.
Great!
Because back then it was, I think, I don't know, maybe $100 to do lifetime.
$100 to do lifetime.
So I'm a VIP every month for as long as the game's around.
That's a good investment.
Best deal ever,
Yes, absolutely best deal ever.
I'm getting jealous. I feel like I should have done this.
Yeah, the lifetime thing went away a long time ago, but I remember the very first time I took a character into, well, first of all, the Old Forest was spooky as could be, and then to actually get to Tom Bombadil's house and the music. Man, Chance Thomas, who wrote the score for the game.
Yes.
Fantastic music. Absolutely.
Oh, it really is great. It really is great. Yeah, and he's just come back to do new music for Mordor.
Cool.
Their Mordor is being released on Monday, actually. So
I'm waiting until December when I can buy it with all my points.
There you go. That's right.
Oh, goodness.
So Corey, what's the future of the seminar project? Any chance of maybe turning that into a book like you did? The title is so similar to Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. I have to ask.
And that's not a coincidence at all.
I didn't think so.
Absolutely not. There is some thoughts about that. It's one of the reasons that a lot of what it really kind of ever since I've done my podcast, there've been a lot of times when I've said to myself, like, okay, what I really need to do is I need to sit down and I need to really look through this, sort of take some notes and really think my way through this. And then I'm like, well, no, that's a waste of time. How about I just do it live on the air? That way, I get to deliver more content. And what's more, I get to have a much more enriching experience, because I always think about stuff better when I'm teaching than when I'm just sort of sitting on my own. Certainly my Exploring the Hobbit book is something that I've always sort of thought about following up with an Exploring the Lord of the Rings book. Actually, I was in talks with Houghton Mifflin about doing that right away when I did the Hobbit book. The reason it didn't happen right away was they wanted me to do it in one volume. They wanted a short one. They're like, can you do Exploring the Lord of the Rings in one volume? And I'm like,
don't you remember the
3,000 pages
not
long?
To do what you did with the Hobbit?
Yeah. Unless your volume can be really thick.
Exactly right.
1,100 pages, maybe.
Goodness.
Yeah. So I tried to wrap my head around that, and I'm just like, no, this is not the book I want to write. I can't do that. I really, that's not what I can do. So,
you think they would have learned the lesson? Because I remember Peter Jackson going to all the film studios, and they all kept saying, you can't do 2 movies. You can only do it in one. And then finally, New Line goes, what are you doing 2 movies for? You need to do this in 3.
Right.
You need that publisher.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So, that's why it didn't happen at first. Yeah. But as we came down, and of course, as things have developed, I'm kind of in a pretty different place now with Signum and stuff. I mean, my book came out.
Oh, yeah.
I wrote the bulk of my book basically during the first semester and right after the first semester that Signum was in existence. So we're way at the very beginning of that project. It would be hard to do the same thing now that I did then.
Sure.
Be able to get that much time to write a book. So it's possible that something book-like will come out of this. It's also possible I might do something else. I mean, I'm really interested in. So for instance, if I had my dream when I sat down to do Exploring the Hobbit, I would have made that like an interactive electronic text, basically. My own fantasy would have been to have the text of the Hobbit that you could like click on and mouse over in order to get so that you're reading the thing and you come to the poem and then you can like click on the poem or mouse over the poem or whatever and get like my discussion of the poem sort of marginally
so
or
almost almost like the annotated Hobbit, but
like
not
the Anderson
quite.
book. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, it was funny. I was actually talking to Doug Anderson about this way back then, and he was sort of very politely saying, well, I've already written the annotated Hobbit. I know you have.
You kind of can't do that, man.
Right,
That's
exactly.
Just not okay.
Yeah. It's not okay. But the annotations would be totally different, and I'd call it something else. And
the not Douglas A. Anderson annotated, not quite Hobbit.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but anyway, that was always the kind of, because always my I never imagined my discussion of The Hobbit in the book to be something which you just kind of sit and read on its own.
Right.
I always wanted,
it's a partner with the book.
Right. My picture is, you have sort of, The Hobbit in one hand and my book in the other hand, and, you read the chapter of The Hobbit, then you read my chapter on that chapter in my book. And, so, but again, ideally what I would have loved was to make some kind of sort of e-text thing, that would do this in a more kind of interactive and engaging
that's a
way.
Pretty cool idea, I have to say. I mean, because you've done such a good job with new media. I mean, you really do stretch the boundaries of what a normal author, if I can put that word in air quotes, would do with the material. And I have to say, I can picture it right now. And I mean, what a cool project that would be.
It would be really cool.
So, so I mean, I could see maybe something like that, kind of releasing, and I don't know how I would release it, and probably in pieces, not in one big, huge Exploring the Lord of the Rings chunk. I could see transitioning from the Exploring the Lord of the Rings, class that I'm doing to doing some kind of project like that.
Yeah.
Probably in collaboration with, I would need help to do that. So, probably in collaboration with other people, whether they be, students of mine or other listeners or things, maybe, I don't know, maybe make it some kind of community project or other. I don't know. But I, at this point in my life, I would see myself kind of doing something more kind of unconventional. That way, rather than just sort of going back to a publisher and publishing another book in the same.
Yeah, that makes sense.
At the end of the day, I find that I like podcasting. I mean, doing the book was cool, and I'm glad I have the book, and that was neat, and I loved that, and I loved the time. That was such a fun time in 2012 when the book came out, the 75th anniversary of The Hobbit, and it was a really exciting time. But really, I don't like trying to sell things. I don't, trying to sell. I'm much happier giving things away than I am trying to sell things. So
your publisher's not going to like that.
No, exactly. No, we never did really.
How many more free copies do you want?
Well, the biggest problem was, I was still doing my Hobbit series, which is, of course, what the book emerged from. Right. So my original podcast Hobbit series, which was like my very first podcast series ever, and I wasn't finished with it at the time I signed the contract. So the publishers were like, "You're not going to finish that, are you?" And I'm like, "Well, I kind of have to." I said I would, and they're like, "You're not going to give away the content of your book, are you?" And I'm like, "Not all of it." So it was hard.
Try not to. Just don't listen to it, okay?
Right.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah.
No, it's tricky, but so we'll see what may come of that. But it will certainly be fun.
Well, that's exciting to know there's a future of it, future to it. That's for sure.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, now that we've broached the topic of exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, we finally get to the core of the questions we wanted to ask you, which is about the book. This episode is going to air on September 21st, the 80th anniversary of the release of The Hobbit. And we are thrilled to have this kind of be our marking our transition, because when this comes out, we will have finished the Silmarillion. We'll have spent a couple episodes talking about the films, and then we'll have this. And then 3 days later, our first episode, an introduction to The Hobbit, will come out, and then we'll dive into the book itself. Awesome. So we're really excited to see what our listeners think of with that. We're hoping to bring in on board a whole bunch of new listeners who maybe thought the Silmarillion was something they needed to read later on.
Right.
So now that we're going to talk about The Hobbit, we want to talk about your book, Exploring The Hobbit. Our first question, you described The Hobbit as being developed in 3 stages. You got the solo stage before The Lord of the Rings was even conceived, the revision stage when it was in development but not yet out, and then this assimilation stage when he'd started to do the corrections because he'd had to revise things and the larger legendarium had been kind of put together. You focus in the book on those first 2 because you want us to read The Hobbit on its own ground and not by reference to that larger legendarium. Now, I suspect a lot of readers, especially those of us who've read his other works, especially those of us who've read them multiple times, have a hard time with that. We tend to focus on it as just a small part of the larger whole. What is it that we lose sight of, or maybe what traps should we watch out for when we do that instead of reading it on its own ground?
Well, it's really challenging. It's because on the one hand, it's hard trying to draw too hard a line. I mean, there's only so many times you can say, "Stop thinking about the Lord of the Rings. Don't connect it with the later story."
Exactly.
I mean, he did through the Lord of the Rings such a brilliant job of bringing all that stuff together. It certainly has, in retrospect, become one unified story. Yeah. So there is, a point past which continuing to try to push the, try to ignore that fact, gets a little bit, feels a little bit silly and artificial. But at the same time, I think that there are a lot of things that you either lose or, even more difficultly, you add when you're thinking about them in conjunction. So, I mean, like the biggest example, obviously, is the ring, right? Yeah. I mean, if from the moment he puts his hand on it in The Hobbit, you're thinking about this entirely through a Lord of the Rings lens, that's okay. It works. Tolkien made that work. It works on purpose. Yeah. You can do that, and that's totally legitimate. But if you do that, you're not going to be getting what The Hobbit is about. Like, you're going to be losing the Hobbit story because it's not about the ring. The ring is not the ring is the central figure of the Lord of the Rings. It is not the central figure of the Hobbit. And if you kind of make it the central figure of the Hobbit, and that looms really large in your own imagination as you're reading the book, you're reading a different story. Now, it's a good story. Yeah. It's still a good story. It's a legitimate story. It's still a story that Tolkien wrote, in a sense, like that he wrote backwards onto The Hobbit.
Right. Yep.
But it isn't the same story. And the story that he originally wrote in The Hobbit is a really cool story. Yes. So, and I think that's a lot of people miss that or lose that story by not by only thinking about it through the Lord of the Rings lens. But once you start to make that separation, once you begin to sort of see okay, what things do I take for granted given the Lord of the, if I accept the Lord of the Rings and everything that happens in it as a given, of course it starts with the ring, but it's beyond that. What about Gandalf, right? There's no evidence that Gandalf is anything but a dude, right? He's a dude who knows magic.
Yeah, right.
He's one of a bunch of dudes. And there's apparently a whole bunch of white wizards that had a council. That's where he went when he left the dwarves and Bilbo behind. And it's, being a wizard seems to be a profession. I mean, when Bjorn says to Gandalf, well, it's some good being a wizard then, right? It's kind of like it's
something you could just
somebody could aspire to being a wizard.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. Bjorn saying, you killed some goblins with a flash of lightning. Well, it's some good being a wizard then, is kind of like, somebody's mother-in-law saying, like, well, it's some use marrying a plumber then when the when the pipes break, it's useful to have you around. Like that's kind of the tone that
you're right, it is.
Yeah, right.
And that does change dramatically if you're viewing it through the Lord of the Rings.
It does.
Right. Yeah.
Does. So, when you're thinking about Gandalf as being one of the Maiar and his role as the Astari and Gandalf the White when he returns and what that means and his purpose and all. Again, you can read all that stuff back into The Hobbit, and of course Tolkien did that, and he did that of course most aggressively in the Appendix A material and the Road to Erebor stuff that you can read more in Unfinished Tales. But in the original Hobbit, that's not who Gandalf is, and that's not what the story is about. So again, to get that story, you're getting a different story, but it's a really fun story, and it's a really neat story. And what's more, to me, the most fun of all is to see both stories and to begin to see sort of the meta story of how that story comes to be, comes to develop in Tolkien's mind.
How it became.
I mean, the work that Tolkien does in retrospect I've never seen anybody who could make such a comparatively small number of changes in a text and transform it so completely. My favorite example of this, the example I use a lot of the time, is in chapter 5, in the Riddles in the Dark chapter, Bilbo has just won the riddle game, right? Gollum couldn't answer the, what have I got in my pocket question. And Gollum has just retreated to his island because he has to get some things first, right? And Bilbo is relieved that Gollum is gone because he was uncomfortable being around Gollum, and he thinks that he thinks that Gollum is just making excuses, right? Like, what could he possibly have on his island that he could need? So the narrator tells us that Bilbo is thinking, he thinks he's seen the last of that creature, that he's gonna think on his promise
disappear
he's just gonna vanish, and he's kind of relieved. And then the narrator says, but he couldn't be more wrong that he's not going to see Gollum again. So that passage is almost word for word the same as in the first edition. But in the first edition, it means something completely opposite to what it means, what those same words and same sentences mean in the later published edition that we all know now. Originally, of course, he couldn't have been more wrong, because Gollum always intended to return and would never, ever, ever cheat at the riddle game.
Right.
It is because Gollum is such an honest and good character at heart that Bilbo is very wrong to think that he would never come back. And of course, in the third edition Hobbit, he is very wrong to think that Gollum would never come back, because Gollum fully intends to come back and murder him.
Kill him.
Exactly. So, there's this one sentence that I'm pretty sure I quote in the book, which again, it's word for word the same in both editions, but Tolkien, by just tweaking the context a tiny little bit, he absolutely reverses the meaning and the impact.
It's not even a subtle change. It's a full 180. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, and he does
going to the heart of the character of Gollum himself. Yeah,
but when you do a side-by-side comparison of the first edition chapter 5 and the third edition chapter 5, there is such a small percentage of text that's changed. It's almost identical, except for there's like a couple paragraphs that he adds in. And you see this is true in so many different places. The work that Tolkien does to synthesize The Hobbit with The Lord of the Rings is so fascinating. The way that he accomplishes this while doing very, very little in the way of actual change to the text itself. And this, the story of Bilbo writing down the false version of the story and
the meta of the story itself.
The meta stuff with this is so brilliant and adds this is an unbelievable level to the whole story. And that so you come to the point, the moral of the story is this is why it's really rewarding to look at the original and then look at the change, and because then you can begin to see and appreciate the depth of the whole thing. Whereas if you come at the whole thing from the beginning purely and only through the lens of the Lord of the Rings, you miss all this awesome stuff.
For sure. Yeah.
It's really neat.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Well, while we're on the topic of the way he brought these disparate stories together, I hope Alan will forgive me skipping ahead a little bit because I want to talk a little bit about the elves.
Yes.
I think some of the biggest fans of Tolkien's work are kind of thrown off by the depiction of particularly the Rivendell elves. Yeah. And despite
mock those elves. I mock them all
I know you do.
I don't anymore, though, thanks to Professor Olsen's enlightening.
No, I have got great ammunition for that argument, thanks to Professor Olsen's.
I know.
I think truly, I think, Corey, you've given the best defense of the playful elves I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely.
That they are. I think your quote is that they are connected with the world in a deeper and stranger sense, and so they take pleasure in all of its ways and varieties.
Absolutely. I mean, they're weird. They're supposed to be weird.
Yeah, right.
It's one of the things that Tolkien does so well, and I've talked about this. I talk about this quite a bit when we get, like the other project that I'm doing now, the Silmarillion film project, where we're talking our way through a totally theoretical serial film adaptation of the Silmarillion. And one of the things that Tolkien captures, which so many fantasy authors just skip entirely, is considering what immortality would actually mean, like how it would change you. You would not look at the world the same way. No, and it's not just about like, I'm really old and have lived a really long time. It is, I experience the world in a totally different way, and that's going to seem really alien to you. As a mortal, when you encounter us, the stuff that I do and the stuff that I care about and the reactions that I have to things are not going to make sense because you fundamentally just don't get what it's like to be
to have
immortal.
Seen what I've seen, and
to have seen what I've seen, and to have the outlook that I have and the prospects that I have. It's just and the relationship that elves have with the world. Yeah, and again, it's not just about it's not about longevity. It's about they are tied to Arda,
sharing the life of Arda.
That humans are not. The whole business about humans. Humans are the they're the outsiders, right? Because their home is not here. Exactly. That's more than longevity. That's the difference, right? Elves' home is the world. Humans are the visitors in the world, and the profundity of that difference in there. So, the Tralalalali elves are, they're an early way of Tolkien describing that. He accomplishes that in more subtle ways, in different ways. When he gets to Lothlorien, for instance, Galadriel's perspective is done differently. But it's not even like he abandons it. Oh, no. One of the things that, studying the Tralalalali elves more when I was writing the book, one of the things that it really changed was after having really, studied that really carefully and thought really carefully about their song and even more the songs that they sing when Bilbo comes back to Rivendell, those are freaking hilarious. When you get to their lullaby songs and stuff in chapter 19, it's awesome.
That's great.
But anyway, then you get to the Lord of the Rings, and when you really pay attention to and don't just kind of uncomfortably skim over the Rivendell elves, which so many people do, when you
having encountered them in the Hobbit,
exactly. But when you get to chapter 3 of the Fellowship of the Ring, and you meet Gildor and his company in the Shire, they are exactly the same elves. They interact with them exactly like the Tralalalali elves. They show exactly those same. Now they talk. They have it. The difference is Frodo sits down and has a long, serious conversation with Gildor, which we don't see Bilbo having in the Hobbit. The elves there. It does happen, but it doesn't happen on camera, right? We don't actually get to hear it. So of course, they have a more serious conversation, and yet throughout we can see the attitude being the same, the delight, the quick to laughter, the teasing and making fun of them. I just think of the similarity in tone, between, but you don't know where we are going, and hobbits are so dull, which Gildor says.
That's right.
Versus like, don't dip your beard in the foam, father. Right? It's long enough without wetting it. Right? These are the same elves. I'm convinced that Gildor and Glorian is totally present singing Tra-la-la-la,
along with the rest of us.
I don't know what the full roll call would have been, but Gildor and Glorian is one of them.
He's definitely in there. Yeah.
That is funny.
That's great.
I'm trying to pick up where Shawn. I'm like, okay, Shawn, you skipped those, so I need to skip that one. Corey, the next question is kind of it's a long question, so I'll just get into it. You do a really wonderful job of illustrating how some of the common themes that we see throughout the Legendarium come up in The Hobbit, but in ways that are more palatable for children, which simultaneously has the effect of making them a little easier to understand for newcomers. A couple of examples that came to my mind, the role of luck, how it's really divine providence. I think your words were that it doesn't diminish his accomplishments or reduce the need for his courage and resourcefulness. That really, really rang with me because we did a whole bunch of stuff on fate and free will and Boethius on Turin. I think we probably did a 40-minute digression on Boethius in this episode.
Awesome. We did,
awesome. Yeah,
and then followed it up with an essay.
Yeah. I wrote a Prancing Pony Pondering on that. Dragon sickness, how it's more than just this, simple like I just want to hoard things. It became kind of a list of all the things that we see, what Shawn and I playfully refer to as Morgoth's greatest hits: self-absorption, arrogance, division, and mistrust. So going back then to the question of reading The Hobbit on its own ground. Does the road go both ways? Can we use The Hobbit to understand the larger Legendarium better than we would without it? Or is it really better to treat each of those works separately, kind of on their own ground, as you say?
Well, I mean, certainly The Hobbit, it wouldn't be fair to say that Tolkien wrote The Hobbit like in order to convey these concepts in a simpler way. Like, it's not like that was his plan or something.
Okay. No.
But at the same time, he's the same guy, right?
Yeah.
And he loves the same stories and is interested in the same things.
Right.
Yeah. So,
sure, yeah.
So in that way, certainly it's definitely applicable. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that when he sat down to write The Hobbit, and this is kind of contrary to some of the ways that he talks about it in his letters and stuff. I think that some of the things that he says about this later, it's not that he's not telling the truth about it, but I think that he's kind of recasting it in some ways.
Yeah. Well, but anyway, the letters, that happens with the letters. One of the things John Garth was quick to point out was that we have to really remember who he's writing to in those letters.
Oh, yes.
Because he's very
kind of performance.
He shifts what he's saying from letter to letter depending on his audience. Yeah. So you're right. You have to kind of take what he says later almost with a grain of salt. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just remembered that.
No, that's exactly right. No, that's very true. That's Verlin Flieger was the person who really drilled that principle into me. Like, whenever you're talking about his letters, always take note first who is it addressed to?
Who's he talking to?
Because
Absolutely.
that's really important to remember. Yes. But anyway, I'm pretty convinced that when he was writing The Hobbit, there was really a firewall down between the Hobbit story that he was writing and the Legendarium that he had been doing.
Yeah.
Not total firewall in the sense of like he's not going to make. I mean, obviously there are connections, right? Obviously he is. The word that I use is recycling, right? He's recycling a lot of the ideas that he had, and the things that he loves.
Sure.
Because remember, by this point, we talk about The Hobbit as being an early thing. Of course, on his publication history, it's an early thing. But let's not forget.
Not in terms of the Legendarium, yeah.
Not in terms of his life.
No.
I mean,
1937,
Yeah, the man is 45 years old when The Hobbit comes out. Yep. So this is not like his teenage work or something.
Right.
But
this
by
is
that
not
time,
the story of Cullervo.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But by contrast, what it is the writing of a 40-year-old guy who believes that who is now. It's been decades since he's given up on getting that stuff published at all.
Yeah.
I mean, he's had the Silmarillion stuff rejected several times by that point, and does not think it's ever going to see the light of day. So he has these concepts that he because he'd never abandoned it completely, but he was not working on the Silmarillion with like much intention for publication at the time he started writing The Hobbit in 1930. Right. So 1929 to 30, he was writing like the Lay of Leithian. He's doing this like spin-off stuff, basically. Yeah. The Lay of Leithian chiefly. But anyway, so clearly he had kind of given up on the idea of publishing the Silmarillion as the Silmarillion at that point. So he recycles stuff. He takes like, you've got you can see it come out, right? You can see the Silmarillion,
Thranduil and the Arkenstone,
and the elves going to Fairy and
Elrond and all this stuff, right?
Yeah.
So he's got the stuff that he's working with, but it's not the same world. Like it's not even the same stories. Even the things that are the same are not the same. Like the Arkenstone it's like on the one hand, it's totally a Silmaril, right? Like, I mean, it looks like a Silmaril. It's named the same thing as a Silmaril. I mean, we
went into that,
that's
didn't
what
we?
the Silmarils are called.
Word,
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So is it a Silmaril? Totally. But is it a Silmaril within the Middle-earth world? No, it's not. Right. It can't possibly be. I mean, like over the course of my podcasting career, I've heard so many people try to couldn't it be the Silmaril of Maedhros, which worked its way underground and came out somehow in the no, it's not.
We had a bit of that.
We've had a bit of that, definitely. We love the conspiracy theorists. It's a lot of fun.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. No, but anyway, okay, so it's again, this is all back to I'm not actually totally digressing from your question.
That's okay. We digress as our trademark.
Do it all the time.
It's
for this reason to sort of say, all right, The Hobbit, read The Hobbit as a commentary on the Silmarillion, say, is kind of dangerous for that reason, right? Because it's not, he was self-consciously doing a different thing. But again, is it relevant? Yeah.
Yeah, it contains elements.
What you learn from studying The Hobbit is really applicable and really illuminating when you go back. And as you say, the fate and free will stuff, Tolkien, for my money, I don't know anybody who has embodied the sort of Boethian marriage of fate and free will. Boethius in the Consolation of Philosophy, as you guys have talked about, has the best explanation that I know of how free will and predestination, coexist at the same time, and how, although they seem like a contradiction to us, are not in fact in contradiction at all. I don't know anyone who has embodied that concept better in fiction than Tolkien has.
Yeah, me either.
Because you see it again and again. I mean, are things doomed? Are things fated? Absolutely. Talks about it all the time, right? Mm-hmm. Do people's choices matter? Can people do? Yes, absolutely. They matter. And the destiny of things really does rest on the choices that they make. And so in some ways you could say The Hobbit is the perfect sort of primer for that concept, because you can see it most clearly. It is simplest. He talks about it most overtly. He's much more insistent just about repeating, like the number of times he uses the word luck.
Right. Yes. Yes, he does.
He doesn't do that kind of thing in The Lord of the Rings. He's more careful to
Right.
Not just
he might use the phrase chance, the term chance a little more, but even then he says, if chance it be, and things like that.
Chance it be, right? And even that only comes, even that phrase or phrases like it only comes up like 3 or 4 times in the whole things. Whereas, think about the number of times Bilbo's luck
is right, all the time.
It's one of those things. So it is another thing that does make the Hobbit kind of easier as sort of a more of a kind
sort of an introduction to the concept.
In fact, I think it's probably Tolkien's writings that we can thank for why burglars in D&D always have like luck +2 or whatever.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Because
that's true.
burglars are lucky because of Bilbo Baggins.
Yeah. Bilbos are lucky because of burglars are and hobbits are, both of them.
Yes, they both have.
In fact, that was actually a conversation that I just had with my 9-year-old, with whom we're reading The Hobbit together for the first time.
Nice.
I'm so excited.
That's awesome.
That's always been a really awkward thing for me with because I have 2 boys, and they know that I am the Tolkien professor, so from their earliest years, J.R.R. Tolkien and the works of J.R.R. Tolkien are it's like the family business,
Right.
So it has a really weird kind of place in our home and in our family life. Like, it is my thing. Like, that is Daddy's thing. Everybody knows that. Mm-hmm. And so I've never wanted to sort of push, because the last thing I want is to have my sons reading The Lord of the Rings as if, they're like working after school in the family store,
right. And they're going to be quizzed on it over dinner.
Right. Exactly. Right. So to have them grow up being like, I had to read Tolkien as a kid because it's like what my dad did.
That's what my dad did.
Of course, I really want them to grow up loving Tolkien, but I've been trying to be really careful to let them find it on their own and not push them into it. So my 9-year-old just a month ago said, could we read The Hobbit together? And I'm like, yes, we can.
Yeah.
So we're reading it together. We're in chapter 9 now, and it's been great. But both of my sons and I were playing D&D together before we were reading The Hobbit together with Mano. So he was, and he played a halfling character. My youngest son Matthias was playing a halfling monk.
Okay.
And
wow.
Okay.
When
there's a mix.
When we were, Well, it was actually one of those really funny personality profile things. Like, my older son made a character who is my older son is bookish and kind of physically awkward and everything, and he made this barbarian bounty hunter. And my younger son
live vicariously.
Exactly. Whereas my younger son, who is small, wiry, and a black belt in karate, made a Hobbit martial artist.
Awesome.
Yeah, that's great.
That's awesome.
That's great.
It was okay, I can see where we're going.
Okay, now I have to insert a new question. What did you roll?
Well, I was DMing, but I rolled a cleric because they needed a healer.
There you go. Yeah, they definitely do.
The paternal support role. That's what.
There you go. Daddy's there to help out.
That is phenomenal.
Yeah.
Exactly. To patch you up.
Yeah, exactly.
But,
that's fantastic.
What a great little
anyhow.
tidbit.
But seriously, we were reading The Hobbit. That was the reaction that Matthias had. He, we got to the references to Bilbo's luck, and he's like, because he was very fond of the 5th edition D&D rule, where the hobbits have the lucky characteristic where if you roll a 1 on your D20 roll, you can re-roll it once. If you're a hobbit. He's like, is that why, my monk had halfling luck? And I'm like, yep, that's exactly
why.
That's awesome.
Based on Bilbo.
Awesome.
Yep.
That is so cool.
I think that may just be the highlight of this episode. I
think
don't
so.
know.
Yeah. That's
great. It's been, but so luck, backtracking, luck. Yes. So in The Hobbit, if you read The Hobbit carefully, you're going to notice, right? Luck. Mm-hmm. It keeps coming up and you keep hearing about it. And that's what I love about The Hobbit. I love how, it's not monotonous, and you don't feel like you're being beaten over the head with something, because he doesn't go out of his way to explain it. He doesn't, the narrator doesn't sit you down and load you down with exposition about the significance of Bilbo's luck or anything. No. It just comes to your attention, so you notice the thing about luck. You notice the thing about his Took side and his Baggins side, and how he's always longing for his hole, and yet his sort of complicated relationship with his adventure. You notice the reference to him not being so prosy as he thinks of in chapter 1, and then his telling riddles to Gollum, and then his making up songs as he's taunting the spiders, and then his poem that he utters as he's returning to the hill, and Gandalf turning and saying what you've been noticing all along, you are not the Hobbit that you were, when we get to the end. So
that took side coming out, I think you pointed out.
Exactly.
Places, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's so neat. So, The Hobbit does a lot of that kind of signposting in a sense, which Tolkien doesn't really do as much in The Lord of the Rings.
No, you're right. And that makes
even
sense.
Though
younger readers,
Yeah, that
signposting, good way of putting it.
Yeah. I think since you mentioned the riddles in the dark scene, if you'll indulge me one more question,
sure.
I know.
Yeah, he's got one more.
We're
I've
running
got
kind
one
of
more.
long here.
So.
Yeah.
Okay.
But one of the things I loved about your breakdown of the riddles in the dark scene was the way the riddles that each of them, Bilbo and Gollum, tell show how much it shows about their nature. And I won't go into detail because I want our listeners to read your book and have their mind blown the way I did, because it was incredible. But I loved your, if I can quote one sentence, I love that you said, Bilbo's world is a world of eggs and bacon and deep sighs of contentment. Gollum's is a world of gnawing desire and perpetual loathing.
Yeah.
I love that, one of the things that we see often in Tolkien's work is how language and poetry are such markers of culture. And I don't know, I'm not even sure I really have a question around that. That was such a great insight for me. And I'd love to hear you talk about it a little bit.
Oh, yeah. No, it's absolutely. I mean, and that's, like all of these things, my reaction is always the same. If somebody says like, I really liked your insight about this. I always feel this. I'm always like, yeah, isn't that cool? Like I'm still really excited from like when I first noticed that, and I remember that was simply, I noticed that when I was writing my podcast episode on the Riddles in the Dark chapter, and there, again, all I was doing was sitting down with the Hobbit, right, and just kind of going through the Hobbit, and it was just it's essentially sort of going on faith. Like I know there's a lot there and a lot that I have never noticed before. So when I first sat down with the riddles, I didn't have a theory, that I was going. I was just like, okay, let's see what happens if you really stop and like pay attention to the poetry and the imagery and like what these things are really conveying. And so I just went through riddle by riddle and was looking at each one and was just like, wow, holy cow, look what you see when because it's not just about like riddles back and forth. Like there's as soon as you start paying attention, there's such a clear trend.
Yeah.
Not only in the subject matter, but in the tone. I mean the emptiness of the wind riddle, the sort of horrible picture of the world that you get from that, the even more, the sadder and more completely wretched, from the darkness riddle. Oh my goodness. That's so awful.
Gollum's riddles give me chills now after reading your breakdown of it.
It's really, because, and I think, it's so easy when you're just reading it, just to think of it as a riddle, right? The whole point is like, this is a thing just to puzzle out, right? And okay, I see what the answer is now, or to sort of appreciate what the answer is. But when you really when I just kind of stop to say, let's look at what they're saying and how they're saying it, and that it immediately becomes clear. And it's Tolkien himself, he doesn't talk about this much. He really downplays the riddles. He'll say like, yes, the riddles are sort of traditional. And it's funny, he not quite grudgingly, sometimes people misunderstood and got the impression that he was just recycling old riddles. And he does kind of quietly say, like, no, I did make up the poetry, right? I did set. So even though some of them are traditional ideas or traditional concepts or traditional kinds of riddles, like for instance, the one that always puzzles people the most are the leg riddle.
That's what I was thinking.
or no legs.
no
on
legs.
One leg.
It's on 3 legs.
Yeah,
yeah.
And that was a thing. Like leg riddles like that were a thing. Which is just not a thing that people get anymore. But that was like a whole subgenre of Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, I don't
riddles.
see leg riddles like trending on Twitter lately.
No.
Hashtag leg riddles.
Hashtag 4 legs got some. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But that's yeah. So by the way, now you have to use hashtag 4 legs got some.
I think we will.
I think we should. Yeah, definitely. Definitely when promoting this episode.
But anyway, yeah, no. So whereas in the if the Anglo-Saxons had Twitter, that would have been trending. That was
right,
that was
right.
So he is adapting traditional forms, but he's making it. But more importantly, not just is he making up new riddles, and some of them are of course entirely quite new, but he writes the verse, and it's not an accident. It's not only, I don't only mean that it isn't an accident that they're in verse. It's not inevitable that they didn't have to be in poetry.
No, of course not.
Often you tell riddles like that in prose. But for it to, but he chose not to do that. So it's just another example of what I find all the time. I mean, really, going back to my Exploring the Lord of the Rings class, I'm basically operating on the same level of faith in my Exploring the Lord of the Rings class. By the time we're now in chapter 6, because it's been now fully 7 months that we've been studying the book, where now we've gotten as far as chapter 6.
Sounds like about our pace.
Pretty much, yeah.
40 episodes and 65 hours on the Silmarillion.
Yeah,
that's right. No, that sounds about good. I mean, one could argue that you've rushed it a little bit, but I think you're doing with Exploring the Lord of the Rings now, I've gotten to the point now where I no longer skip anything.
Yeah.
Like I'm not even doing a class anymore. I'm doing a commentary paragraph by paragraph my way through the Lord of the Rings. Yeah. And that's how I plan to do it from now on. So I don't even know. It might take me 10 years to finish the Lord of the Rings at the rate at which I'm doing it.
That's awesome.
But it's that same kind of thing. I mean, right now, like this past, just a couple days ago. So, it's July now when we're recording this. And I just did, a segment in like the middle third of chapter 6, the Old Forest chapter, starting right after Frodo sings his song, East or West, all woods must fail.
Yeah.
So starting right after that. And it's almost entirely landscape description of like when they get to the bald hill with no trees on it that they can see out from.
Right.
And then they go down and they try to find their way up to the north part of the forest, and they get rerouted down and they end up down by the Withy Windle. That's what we covered in class on Tuesday. So there's almost no dialogue.
Wow.
Almost nothing happens other than them walking from the bonfire glade to the hill and then down and ending up at the Withy Windle. And the passages that we were discussing were almost entirely landscape description. But, I go into this class saying, I bet I'm going to wager that we're going to find some awesome stuff.
I think you will.
That by the end of this class, we're going to be like, this is incredible. And it was awesome. I mean, the way,
cool.
the way that we've been seeing like the Old Forest and what the Old Forest is and the relationship between the hobbits and the trees and what we've learned about Merry and about Frodo and their points of view and their backgrounds. And it's so neat. I mean, and my goodness, it's going to be so cool to get to Treebeard, in the 2020, 2021, whenever it is we get to Treebeard.
Right, yeah.
That's probably when we'll get to him, actually, now that I think about it.
Probably.
Yeah. So anyway, but that's what I have found. And for me, this is kind of what defines greatness, like what makes for a great book is when you can do that, when I know that like, no matter how carefully I read, no matter how slowly I go, no matter how many times I read it, I'm going to be finding new stuff that I never saw before. And, the text is going to reward the time that I put into it, looking at it.
Absolutely.
It doesn't always happen. It doesn't always happen, but with Tolkien, it does. Pretty much always happens.
Yeah, and I couldn't agree more. That's one thing, when Shawn and I started out, we were new to podcasting. We weren't new to Tolkien and certainly weren't even new to the Silmarillion, but we were new to trying to figure out how to talk our way through a book. And I think, he jokingly said we rushed our way through it. I look back on some of those early episodes and think, yeah, we could have drawn that out. That probably should have been 2 episodes, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
But, I look back to like our trilogy on Turin, or our trilogy on Beren and Luthien, or the 2 episodes on Tuor. And, there's so much richness there. Yes. And even then I felt like we were still moving a little too quickly.
Oh,
There's just a ton of material. And I can't wait now. We finished the Silmarillion, we've wrapped that up, and we're in the middle now of just doing a couple of kind of bonus episodes on the films just for kicks and giggles. But I can't wait to dig into the Hobbit and see what we find there. Yeah. So good stuff.
Oh, yeah.
It's going to be so fun.
I'm going to go ahead and ask you one last question. Again, thank you for extending the time for us. I really appreciate it.
No problem.
Thank you so much.
No problem.
You end in the book, almost end, with the discussion of eucatastrophe, which our listeners have heard us talk about over and over again. Considering that most of us probably read The Hobbit first, this is really the first time we see it. And, of course, it's a hallmark of Tolkien's work that his fans love and, well, I guess his critics mostly don't. But similar to the question earlier, the ending isn't overly simplistic and rose-tinted. You talk about victory coming through suffering, which is really the case in Lord of the Rings. I'm not sure, like the last one that Shawn asked, I'm not sure we have a question here per se. Tolkien's idea of the eucatastrophe, though, is a topic we started off with in our very first episode when we talked about on fairy stories, and it's something we come back to a lot. So we'd love to just get like 5 minutes of you talking about eucatastrophe.
Absolutely. What eucatastrophe is, there is a sense in which, remember in On Fairy Stories, he describes it, and this is kind of one of the most interesting claims that he makes. As far as like when you think about On Fairy Stories, not as like the sort of manifesto of Tolkien's own approach to fantasy, but as a work of analysis and criticism of fairy stories, that are not written by Tolkien.
Yeah, a definition of what all fairy stories have. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, one of the most fascinating, remarkable claims that he makes is that idea that eucatastrophe is this essential element to fairy stories. That like all real fairy stories have like some glimpse of this kind of thing. It's a remarkable claim, and my point is not to sort of like debate with Tolkien about that or whatever, but merely the fact that in his mind, like in his perception, this was the sort of the be all and end all, well, not the be all, but anyway, this is like that.
Without this, it's not
that essential feature.
Not fantasy. Yeah, it's a requirement.
Exactly. And I think, and this is where, I come back to you just mentioned Tolkien's critics, and the dumb thing that all superficial critics of Tolkien say.
Thank you for putting it plainly.
They say lots of dumb things, but the dumbest thing and the most pervasive dumb thing that bad critics say is that Tolkien's world is so simplistic, like it's all completely black and completely white, and all the good people have a happy ending, and it's like just like not in touch with the real world.
Give that man a copy of Turin.
Oh, exactly, right? Seriously. But there isn't, even in The Hobbit, that's an unjustifiable.
Yeah, it really is.
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Even Beorn. I think some of you mentioned some stuff about Beorn, but in regards to that,
Beorn, and like tell that to the people of Lake Town, for crying out loud.
Right.
Seriously.
Yeah.
You don't even have to go as far. Even like the very high-profile death of Thorin, and Fili and Kili, but whatever. Yeah. The point is that there is, of course, this one sense in which no, Tolkien isn't about rosy happy endings and everything works out. Even the way in which he almost this is not a fair way to say it, but he comes within a hair of poking fun at that, with Sam on the field of Cormallen. Right. When Sam says, is everything sad going to come untrue? When for a moment it looks like we're going to get a happy ending, even when, not just that everything.
Not just a happy ending, but an everything happy. Yeah.
Right,
exactly. Right. Even
Universally
the things that had been sad are gonna reverse themselves and become happy. And of course, no, that's not. You know, it might look like that in the moment, but that's not how things are going to turn out.
And I love Sam's optimism at that moment. But that's beside
absolutely.
the point.
Right. Exactly. Right. And, followed up by the moment, he says, when, and his all my wishes come true, when the minstrel sings the song of Frodo of the Fingers, in the Ring of Doom. But anyway, it's so Tolkien, you could see him almost like self-consciously flirting with that idea, of the resolution of stories and happy endings, and of course, because those moments, and I have to think that we're supposed to understand that Sam himself is at that time remembering, cognizant of, recalling the conversation that he had with Frodo on the stairs of Cirith Ungol about stories and whether stories have a happy ending or a sad ending, and that some stories are a good kind of story to be landed in, and others might not be, but they're still a good kind to listen to. Yeah. I think that's one of the reasons why Sam is bursting into tears at that moment, because he's seeing, on the one hand, you could say one really simple reading of that moment is, so it turns out that Sam has now found that he was in a happily ever after story after all. When at the moment when they were having that conversation on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, he was afraid that it was a sad ending story that he was in after all. Right. But of course, that's not it either, I think. And, the reason why he's laughing and crying at the same time, I mean, I think, in that moment, Sam is understanding it's not, the categories into which he was putting stories, happy ending, sad ending. That's not how stories are. That's not how life is. That's not how stories are. Sam within the story is recognizing that that's not how that stories aren't black and white.
It's not binary.
That it's not a binary situation, as of course is evidenced by the story that he was talking about, that he alludes to explicitly during that conversation. Of course, the story of Beren and Luthien. Is the story of Beren and Luthien a happy ending or a sad ending story? Discuss. That's exactly the sort of the situation. So anyway, all of this comes back to eucatastrophe, because it may be true that stories, it's not a binary situation, right? It's not about black and white. It's not about happy ending or sad ending. But there is still one sort of core rock bottom truth, and that is eucatastrophe. That is that even if it is a story which the people inside it would consider a sad ending story, there still lies the eucatastrophe, even in the story of Turin. I mean, nobody could accuse the story of Turin of being a happy ending story. It's just not. But you think about the fact that the grave of the hapless, is one. When Beleriand sinks beneath the waves, there are only a few things which are preserved as like memorials of that whole time, and Turin's grave is one of those.
One of them,
and it's clear Tolkien had that. Even in the story of Turin, and the fact, of course, if you read the history of Middle Earth stuff, you look at his early Silmarillion materials, which should give a small plug for this in the Mythgard Academy series that I've been doing now for the last few years.
Plug away. Are you kidding? You can plug anything you want on this.
So the Mythgard Academy is a series of sort of open classes I've been doing, and we just kind of sort of read through a book and discuss our way through books. And the books that we do are voted on by our donors and supporters, and we generally, because our donors and supporters are who they are, we do Tolkien every other book, and they are. The electorate, in their wisdom, have decided that we should go through and discuss our way through the entire history of Middle Earth series.
Man, that's a daunting task.
It is, and I've never read the history of Middle Earth cover to cover.
No, I've read it like a reference piece. Yeah,
same here. Yeah. But because we're doing this, I've been going through volume by volume, cover to cover, for the first time in my life, and it's really fascinating to do. if anyone is ever interested in kind of digging into that early stuff, the best place to find this stuff, we have a separate iTunes podcast feed for the Mythgard Academy. So you can search for the Mythgard or the Mythgard Academy.
It's in iTunes U, isn't it?
It is on iTunes U as well.
Yeah.
And also the video recordings are in our YouTube channel, the Signum University YouTube channel. You can find different playlists for all the stuff that we've done. So we do lots of things in addition to Tolkien. We've done Watership Down and Dracula and Ender's Game and The Princess Bride and
Princess Bride. I gotta go do that one.
Mr. Norrell and all kinds of different. But it's been great fun.
That sounds like
we
fun.
did Dune. Oh yeah, we did Dune. That was
wow. Shawn, that's right up your alley.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. We spent a long time on Dune. That was really fun.
That sounds fun.
Anyway, so in the early Silmarillion, so getting back to Turin and Eucatastrophe, in the early Silmarillion stuff, he never ever wrote it. He never wrote the story of like what happens in the end times,
right?
In Middle Earth. But eventually, Morgoth is going to come back from outer darkness, and there's going to be the last battle. That's where time ends. So the end times of Middle Earth are the fight in the Dagor Daggerath, the Battle of Battles, at the end of the end. Turin Turambar is going to be the one who kills Morgoth with his black sword. So Turin with his same sword is going to be the one who gives Morgoth his death blow. And that's not in the published Silmarillion because Tolkien kind of dropped that idea and didn't incorporate it into any of the later stuff. So, Christopher left it out, didn't include that in the published Silmarillion because it was only ever sketched and outlined anyway.
Right.
And we don't, maybe he changed his mind about that. Maybe he wouldn't have written that had he written that stuff out later on in his life. But you can see the impulse, right?
Yeah,
the impulse.
Right. The
even the
Turin
story has a Eucatastrophe.
Yeah.
It just is, thousands and thousands and thousands of years from now.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. He, Nienor and Turin both have a happy ending. They go through this purification, and their experience has made them into something extraordinary, which not only makes their whole experience eucatastrophic, but makes them the instruments of eucatastrophe, the entire world. It's this it's a kind of amazing thing. And that is so if there is a way in which Tolkien is, everything turns out well and everything, yes, he does believe that, and it goes back to what we were mentioning about fate and free will, right?
Yep.
There is
Absolutely.
a plan, and that plan is a good plan at the end of the day. In the end, possibly my single favorite Tolkien quote comes from Leaf by Nigel in the conversation that Nigel and Parrish have right before Nigel goes up into the mountains at the end, when they're sort of regretting the decisions that they made while they were still alive. And Nigel says, "It could have been different, but it couldn't have been better."
Yeah. Yeah.
So and they're talking about their mistakes, how they screwed up and didn't do things right. And again, that's like, for me, that's the core of the eucatastrophic idea. Like things could have been different, but they couldn't have been better. At the end of the day, at the end of all, maybe at the end of all things, certainly at the end of all things, will be, we will see that everything, even the things that look most horrible, even the life experience of Turin Turambar, again, thinking of another Silmarillion quote, like, evil will be good to have been.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Although it remains evil, as Mandos insists.
Mandos is
nevertheless, it will still
gets that in there.
I love that. He always has the kind of the mood busting quotes,
Bring you down to earth. Yeah.
Exactly. But so to me, that's the sort of the heart of Eucatastrophe. It's not just. It's easy to focus on Eucatastrophe as like that dramatic turning point, like the arrival of the eagles in The Hobbit, or to me the single eucatastrophic moment that gets me absolutely every time. I mean, the one passage in Tolkien I can never read with a dry eye is the arrival of the black ships at the Harlond.
I'm with you. I'm so with you on that.
Oh,
when Éomer lifts up his sword to defy them, and then I'm going to start crying now. I keep talking about it. I mean, it's there are those moments of eucatastrophe, and of course that's like the high profile thing, right? But that's not. In a sense, that's not the essence of eucatastrophe, because it doesn't, Aragorn doesn't always show up. The eagles don't always show up. sometimes you get the battle of unnumbered tears, and everybody dies and gets hauled off into captivity, and everything's horrible or looks horrible from that vantage point.
For a time. Yeah.
Yeah. But in the end, the story that is being written, the music that is unfolding, no one can change the music in Iluvatar's despite. And, the story that he's telling is still a good story that has a good ending. As, Bilbo says, stories should have good endings, right? Mm-hmm. Story of the world has a good ending. And that's what, and sometimes we get a glimpse or a foretaste of that. And that's what Eucatastrophe is.
That is awesome. Wow, Corey, thank you. Awesome. What a response that was. Folks,
that's fantastic.
That wraps it up for another episode of the Prancing Pony Podcast. Corey, Shawn and I really want to just express our thanks again for not only joining us today, for joining us for longer than you'd expected, and for digressing with us and enduring our digressions. We have really enjoyed our conversation, and I think I can safely speak for Shawn when I say you absolutely have a standing invitation to join us anytime.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you. I hope to take you guys up on that at some point.
Yes, definitely. And maybe we'll see you in Virginia next year.
Oh, that would be great. Yeah, if you guys could come to Mythmoot, we could do a session together. Yeah, that'd be awesome.
That would be great. Well, and listeners, be sure to join us again in 2 weeks when we finally dive into the book that started it all, the book that without which none of the three of us would be here talking to you. In 2 weeks, we'll be giving an introduction to The Hobbit.
Now, I don't think we have anybody listening who doesn't already own that book, but if for some reason you don't, or if you just want maybe a new cheap copy to read along and take notes in, go to the official library tab on our website, the prancingponypodcast.com, where we have links to The Hobbit, as well as to Corey Olsen's book, Exploring J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, and links to other books, audiobooks, music, and some other cool things for your Tolkien shelf.
And we'd really appreciate it if you help us out by leaving a review on iTunes. Even if you don't listen to us on iTunes, you can still leave us a review there.
Yep.
It only takes a few moments and an Apple ID. Some of you have said some wonderful things there, and we really appreciate that. And if you haven't done so already, you may subscribe on iTunes or through your favorite podcast app. You can find our RSS feed on our website, theprancingponypodcast.com, or find us on Google Play, TuneIn, Stitcher, and most other podcast directories.
And a big thank you to those of you who are connecting with us on social media. Corey talked about that today, talking about the community and just how the Tolkien community is something really special. Well, we set out to start that conversation that everybody could join. That's why we called it the Prancing Pony, and it's why we have the online common room on Facebook at the Prancing Pony Podcast and on Twitter at Prancing Pony Pod. And a huge thank you to our Patreon supporters. Our Patreon campaign's been underway for a bit now, so check out patreon.com/prancingponypod and our social media channels for ways that you can join the fellowship of the podcast.
And social media is a great place to share our podcast as well. So please retweet us, share us, tell your friends, and thank you so much for doing that.
Absolutely. And one last thing, as always, don't forget to send your questions, comments, or all your Lotro Gold and crafting materials to the Prancing Pony Podcast at gmail.com, and we'll try to get them into our next episode. Well, folks, 2 hours plus is still far too short a time to spend amongst such admirable listeners, but until next time.
Farewell, friends.